Well, good morning, everybody. We're so glad that you're able to join us. So yeah, just to give a quick introduction of ourselves, my name is Grant, and originally from Iowa, and had been a missionary in France, and that's actually where I met Miho. And then we've been here in Japan since 2010.
Yeah, I'm his wife, a little more than a wife, I suppose. Yeah. But I was born and raised in Yokohama. I suffered from a depression when I was in high school, and that's how I came to Christ. But I consider myself as a returnee because I was saved first, but still went overseas after that for college and worked there a little bit, came back to Japan. And so, so today, we'll be speaking out of our experience of pastoring, but also as an experience of me being a returnee myself too.
Awesome. And then we lead Tokyo Life Church. Should we go to the next slide? Mm-hmm. So we pastor Tokyo Life Church, which started in 2015, so 6 years ago, as a bilingual church in the Ikebukuro area, in partnership with our home church in Boston, and then Kurume Bible Fellowship that meets at the CAJ campus. And we had this vision of being this diverse community in the greater Tokyo area that will bring life and give hope so that Japan will experience the gospel and be transformed. And so obviously, as Japan is majority Japanese people with just a few internationals, we felt like we wanted to be this bilingual church in order to really reach one of the most unreached people groups. So it's a community that's not limited just to the Japanese, but also it's not just for internationals. And so it's not necessarily a tool of using English, but it's really who we are and using that to really be a bridge to welcome people, and especially as a place to welcome back returnees, of wanting to be a community that kind of is a bridge for the Japanese side and for that international context. So yeah, and then in January we had our 6th anniversary, and it just helps us think back on all that's happened in these past few years. And so when we started, it was just a dozen people, just 3 kids, as we had a children's ministry offering the Alpha course, a few different events, and there's no returnee ministry. There's not small groups in the beginning, because actually as 12 people, we were a small group ourselves. And then before COVID hit, as we've been online now since last March, we had around 90 people, including kids. Things have fluctuated this past year of some new people and then some people moving away. And at one point we were highly international. And so we've deliberately continued to work on how can we reach Japanese people? How can we help them grow and get connected? And even the mixture of people in our church, especially of returnees, there's a wide range of those who had been, living abroad, working in their, 40s or 50s and coming back, young families that started there in their 30s, college students and, graduates. And so you have this whole range of returnee doesn't mean just one thing.
So along the way, we made lots of mistakes and there are lots of regrets. I would say in one expression, our mistakes could be summed up in making assumptions. So we make assumptions about returnees based on our own experience, like for me as a returnee, or a few returnee cases that we are familiar with. And it sounds really bad, but I didn't realize returnees came in various shapes and sizes. So, I used myself as a point of reference to understand and relate to other returnees. So I would make assumptions like, oh, surely she knows how to pray, or, oh, surely he's fine with conversing in English, or, oh, surely they know how to care for others. And it turns out, so much of my assumptions were wrong.
And so we realized that, there's all sorts of layers to people. And so Some things is just even their identity. And so how they see themselves of, I'm still very Japanese, or I've become more Western. And so it depends on when they went abroad, how long they were there, kind of what was the purpose of studying or working. It can be even their language ability. And so the English level can vary, even if you've spent 3 years living in the UK or America, it doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, I'm fluent in English. Similar to me being here in Japan for 10 years doesn't mean, oh, I'm perfect in Japanese. And so you realize it could be even the husband at work is stronger in English, where maybe the wife who's raising the kids at home doesn't have as much opportunity to practice. And so just realizing the length of time doesn't necessarily mean that they are as comfortable. And then also their spiritual heart language of what they feel comfortable to really share and open up. Sometimes it could be English allows them to think and experience things, but others it could be I need to talk and engage with what I'm most confident in. And then even the spiritual state, there's some that had never been in a church, never had anything to do with Christianity before they went abroad. So they might have a positive image of Christianity. They might be curious. They might be seeking. They might have gone through Bible studies. Maybe some actually took the step of coming to faith as they lived abroad. And so just figuring out where they're at spiritually is a whole range of aspects. And then even their life stage. So as a single person, as a student, or as a family, and then as they come back, a single person has control of their time and how they, when they're available. Where a family, if work is 6 days a week, or their kids have all sorts of different programs, it may be difficult of, even if one spouse wants to come to church or be involved in something, if the rest of the family isn't interested, then that adds layers of how to actually receive them and make that connection. And so some of the results is that we can misjudge their needs and not really take care to follow up with them. And so it can mean that even as they come back, they can easily slip away as they don't really feel like they're growing or connecting in a church.
So I just want to share like some of the specific examples of our mistakes. Like the first one, too much expectations. So this family returned as active seekers. And when they were in the US, they invited many like Japanese families to the Japanese ministry there. And when they returned, we were still like preparing to launch our church. And we invited them to our launch team meetings, like hoping that they would invite their like non-Christian friends. And they came to our church service, and the kids got involved in Life Kids, which is our children's ministry. And we offered them an Alpha course, and we invited them to our home for a family life group, but they eventually stopped coming. And it was initially just their son, like not enjoying our kids program as much, because at that point, like we were still meeting in a very dark, like small restaurant where there was no space to run around. And so the boy was so active and he's like, not fun. But I think the primary reason I suspect is that, they didn't see themselves as launch team members, bearing the responsibilities of the church. I think they saw themselves rather as like takers or like receivers than givers. So we put like too much expectations on the seekers. And in our church, seekers often like do volunteer actually. And so I'm not saying that, we shouldn't have expected something out of them. But I think the balance was a little off of the balance between caring for them and also like having them to contribute. And another thing is too much English and not enough Japanese. One of the returnees actually said, "This is a church for foreigners, right?" And it was far from like our intention, as our vision says, so that Japan will experience the gospel and be transformed. In our mind, our primary target has always been the Japanese. And as hard as it was to accept that our church gave that kind of impression of an expat church, we understood the reason why. Because of who we had on our launch team, we had some meetings or gatherings only in English, or Sunday school teachers were mainly English speaking at first. So often the children's program was done in English only, like without any like translation. And now like it's, completely bilingual. But if the Japanese thinks it's not a place for them, more likely they'll stop coming. And for kids as well, some believe that, some like on our launch team, like believe that, we can continue to offer children's program in English, appeal to the parents who want to raise their children bilingually. But, the kids are quite honest. They don't act the way that the parents want them to. If they don't understand what's going on, they won't enjoy the program. If they don't enjoy the program, then they will resist coming. And if they resist coming, the parents will stop coming. Another thing, lack of deeper regular relationship. So there were a couple college students, returnees that came to our worship service, and they came a couple times just to check out the church. But at that time, we didn't have a suitable group for them, a suitable like life group to connect them to. So it's one thing to be friendly and cordial after the service during the fellowship time, but it's quite another to have a steady group where they feel connected and rooted. So because the deeper relationship was missing, they eventually stopped coming. And it was really painful for us because we had the desire to provide such a group, but we simply didn't have enough manpower to pull it off, whether because of the size of the church or the kind of people we had. So eventually started a Japanese speaking college group because of the regrets and continual needs. And I think for Japanese, you need a Japanese speaking environment and relationship. And another thing, lack of Christian formation. So there was a returnee who got saved and baptized while being in North America. But because of the way that she carried herself, she was confident, she's capable, a career woman type. And so I just kind of assumed that she was spiritually mature as well. And so I didn't really provide much training for her or make sure where she was, like in terms of her understanding of the Bible or, acquisition of like Christian practices, like attending the service or, doing the devotion or serving or giving. And because of our assumption, we failed to grow her. Like she was probably a spiritual child, but we failed to grow her to be a spiritual young adult or spiritual parent. So what do we do now? We never make assumptions. And in order to avoid making assumptions, then what do we need to do? The first step is a private meeting with a returnee. So yeah, that's the first step. So before we make any move, we always spend time either like 101 or 102 with the returnee. So 101 is like one, church person and a returnee, or 102 is like two of the church people and a returnee, or one church person and a returnee and their previous discipler. The format can be either Zoom or in person. Like you can start out with a Zoom meeting, between Japan and while they're still overseas, then, meet up in person after this person comes back to Japan. Or you can start out with a Zoom meeting after the returnee already like comes back to Japan. Then, the next meeting would be, meeting up in person. Somewhere in Japan, or another thing, meet up in person from the beginning. So why do we meet? The purposes, 4 purposes. Number 1 is the intimidation before being introduced to a group. So it's actually really intimidating for a returnee to be thrown into a group where they don't know anybody, whether a Zoom service or a small group. So if you meet with a returnee privately, they'll at least have one person that they know in that group. So familiarity lessen the anxiety on the returnee part, that they'll feel more comfortable coming to a group gathering. And number two, start building a spiritual relationship. So first of all, this is for us to know a returnee with a genuine interest, right? Like if God brought this person to you, you can't just treat them like irresponsibly. You also know that like people on the other side of the world, they sacrifice so much. This person being here is like the result of, their blood, sweat, and tears. 血と涙と汗の結晶. That's why we say it in Japanese. But so when you know that the previous disciples poured so much, you just can't treat them like like you feel responsible. So so you want to make sure that it's not just a relationship that you're building, but it's actually a spiritual relationship, spiritual like friendship. If the relationship doesn't have any like spiritual components or flavor, you're actually not offering anything different from what the world can offer. So discipleship actually starts from the moment that you meet with this person. I mean, although the discipleship for this person has already started while they're overseas, but between you and this person, this discipleship happens from the moment that you meet this person. So the spiritual component or the flavor actually doesn't mean that, you have to have a formal testimony time or like a Bible study time, like when you first meet with this person, let's have a time of testimony kind of thing. But rather, a spiritual conversation is blended into the whole of the conversation. So you may be having a very casual conversations, and yet still, you may draw out some information and you may reinterpret it like from a Christian perspective so that, you can make them aware of God's presence in their lives. Or if you draw out some intimate information, you may pray about it with them, or you may hear them say something that reminds you of a Bible verse, then you can quote it. Or you may naturally share how you experienced God in a similar situation. So, it's your life story. It's a testimony like out of your daily life. So the thing is, like, exactly what you're doing in your head, I'm sharing my testimony without them necessarily knowing that they're being shared a testimony to. Another purpose, assess that returnee. So as you like converse, you draw out some key information about them, whether, about their identity, language ability, life stage, and most importantly, spiritual state. And you're thinking like in your head, okay, so what would be the next step, for this person in terms of their journey toward Christ? How can I welcome this person in the life of the church? And what's the best route? So you're thinking all these things as you're, like talking. And often I think this is best to be done in Japanese. The internationals could partner with a Japanese person to do this, to like pick up every little like nuance. As we all know that Japanese are not the most straightforward kind of people. So what you want to draw out, like in terms of the spiritual state, is like how they got interested in Christian gatherings overseas, or why they like it, how they see Christians, how they see Christ, what they understand and believe about the Bible, or what kind of interactions with Christians they are desiring now that they are back in Japan. And even if you heard that someone made a profession of faith, it's good to double check in Japanese, as we know that, some people just say, oh, yes, I believe under pressure. So also, separately talking to their previous discipler is very helpful too. And then the fourth purpose, determine the best route or the next step to welcome the returnee into the life of the church. So after you assess, the returnee, you'll determine the best route or the best next step to welcome them into the life of the church.
And so some of the factors that we might think about oh, how can we help these Japanese people come into church? It's not ultimately about the style of worship, the language, people that have a similar background, but I think at the core is really making a welcoming and a loving environment. And so there's a number of factors of what that could look like, but it's really having that sense of embracing people with different backgrounds. So it's giving them room, not being judgmental, offering grace for those who don't think and act like everybody else, making sure that their story is heard and appreciated rather than, oh, this is what Christians should think or do. And really taking a genuine interest in their story basically you're meeting them where they're at rather than expecting them to be at a certain place. And so helping them, finding out where they're at and helping them try to take that next step in their journey towards Christ. And so that's really demonstrating love based on the context, inviting them to different groups, different gatherings, giving attention to their story, celebrating it, showing hospitality in ways that are appropriate. So maybe if they were in America, having people over in their homes was a very common and natural thing. That might not be the same thing here, say in Tokyo, but what does that look like to really express love and care for them, and how to make that people feel attracted, that there's a loving community here, and that there's also a place for them to belong. I think people are looking for, do I fit in? Do I have a place here? And so in your churches, it may not be that you have small groups in place. It may be the different sizes. It's just kind of one big family. But if you're able to help them have that sense of they belong here, that gives them security. And so as we think about what would a returnee sensitive church look like, I think it's really this missional kind of outward focused church that's really reaching out to non-believers. And so it's not trying to do some sort of trick or gimmick of being or saying certain things, but really intentionally embracing people without judgment, welcoming them, and helping them wherever they're at, of non-believers, whether they're seekers or if they're young Christians, and not expect them also to live and act like traditional Christian believers or mature people, because that's not where they're at that moment.
So I want to talk a little bit about the role that language plays. So, where does the language come in? What's the role language plays in English? Is English essential, like in reaching out to returnees, or is it Japanese that's essential? Because we are a bilingual church, we can start with the case of bilingual or like English-speaking churches. So in a bilingual church or English-speaking church, a Japanese-speaking fellowship and discipleship is essential for Japanese, like more than they realize or they want to admit. Especially when they don't have a solid understanding of the faith, we need to solidify the foundation in their own language. And English can be a language of additional fellowship and discipleship just to grow them as global Christians. In our experience, like returnees who join an English small group end up in a Japanese small group. And those who join a bilingual group often end up in a Japanese group, yet still join the bilingual group from time to time as an additional opportunity. And I think this happens because of two reasons. One is relatability. People want others to get their story. If the stories of others around them are not relatable, it's really hard to feel connected. So, perspectives and concerns as a Japanese back in their homeland are often different from those of internationals in Japan. For example, a Filipino parents who homeschool their children may not be able to relate to or give very helpful advice to a returnee mother who has to think about her kids' transition into a Japanese school. And the second reason, I think, is nurturing. So English-speaking groups tend to be more like flat in their like relationship between the leader and other members. Small group leaders prefer to be rather like facilitators than shepherds. But Japanese-speaking group leaders often operate as like shepherds. So as young Christians, I think returnees probably feel more nurtured in a group where the leaders like provide care and guidance like intentionally. And for Japanese speaking church, I think English speaking fellowship serves as a breather, and it keeps fostering their global identity. And I'm speaking this out of my own experience. Yeah, so example of such fellowship could be, like interactions with bilingual or bicultural like Christian friends outside of the church. That's Christian friends who are also returnees that may go to other churches, or involvement in a parachurch ministries that are globally oriented. And in my case, like involvement in OM ship, like Operation Mobilization Ship, or OM mission trip in the summertime that served well. Personal like fellowship with international friends with the church. They can give a sense of comfort to like returnees with like a familiar expression of love of, like hospitality, hugs, and more casual, relationship. So if they're like immersed in the Japanese church, they can also help navigate the returnee to adjust and find their way in a Japanese church. And finally, involvement in church-based ministry requiring them to use English, like hosting a team on a missions team, or like translating for foreign guest speakers, or like sports ministry.
And so we think of, there's different routes of how to best welcome them into the church and where they can connect. And so we want within any church to have a sense of what it is that's important to help those entry points. And so within our church, there'd be 4 kind of pillars of discipleship, that this is opportunities for them to really connect. So obviously the Sunday worship service, that's a space for anybody to come and to worship, to hear the word of God, respond in prayer. And so that's a core component. But for some people, that may be a big jump for them to attend. And so life groups really reach the heart of small group that may be meeting every week or every other week, 4 people to 12 people. And that's really where they can, share their stories. Maybe it's doing a Bible study or a discussion group, being able to pray, eating together, just a way for them to really experience and bond with others and to grow. And so we want life groups is not just for Christians, but also a way for new people to get connected. So there's always that sense of openness to welcoming new people in. And then Christian education classes is helping the disciples. So at our church, we have 2, we call it basics of the faith class, and then a baptism preparation class. And so it could be, 5 or 6 weeks long that allow them to really study and understand things on a deeper level. And so this is where in the next slide, you'll see kind of assessing where they're at and trying to help them take that next step in their journey of faith. And so figuring out what is it attitude, or is it knowledge that just are lacking that understanding to help them, trust in Jesus or accept that by faith. And so classes can be one positive way to really build some level of foundation with them. And also it's not just about head knowledge of communicating information, but also building that relationship and where they sense that you love and you care for them. And then the 4th one is ministry. So of serving together, there might be certain roles in the church that are definitely reserved for, mature leaders or key, members of the church. But there are ways in which wherever they're at spiritually, that there's a place that we want, like the priesthood of all believers, that people feel like I have a place, I have gifts that I can offer and serve. And through helping, they can build relationships and also feel like, oh, this is a place for me, rather than I just kind of come and take, or I sit passively, but I'm also a part. And so this scale is called the angle scale of evangelism. I found to be really helpful because it's one thing if you just think of non-Christians and Christians, that isn't super helpful, but of understanding, okay, it may not be how can I help this person come to accept Christ, but where are they at? And then how can I help them take even one step closer? And so some, it may be, I know nothing about the Bible. I know nothing about Jesus. I couldn't even name a gospel. I couldn't even name a book of the Bible. And so if that's where they're at, meeting them there and helping them, developing an interest in Christianity, or it may be, okay, I believe Jesus lived and these things, but I don't really see why I'm not a sinner, or I don't need, like, helping, okay, that's the next step. And then hopefully you'll see that leads them to coming to faith, and then how to take that next step of growing in faith. And so this is just kind of a helpful reference of, okay, what's that next step, in which is it just they don't know the knowledge of even, what the gospel is. And so you have to start where they're at.
So we talked about routes from entry to discipleship. So Grant earlier talked about the 4 pillars of the church's discipleship. And here's the synergy, this diagram shows the synergy of those 4 pillars. Very quickly, between the worship service and life groups, you can see that, the pastors connect a new visitor that comes to a worship service to a life group, and life group leaders invite their new life group member to a worship service, as some may come to a life group, but not the worship service yet. Or life group to Christian education classes. So life group leaders send out their member to a Christian education class for several weeks, and class facilitators share that information about the member to their life group leader to just better care for them. Christian education classes and ministries, facilitators of the classes find out the participant's spiritual gift. We do spiritual gift tests too in the class, and then they communicate to ministry leaders. Ministry leaders versus worship service. So pastors connect a Christian newcomer to ministries that they're interested in, and ministry leaders may communicate their needs to the pastors. And life groups and ministries. So life group leaders encourage their members to participate in ministries of their interest, and ministry leaders recruit volunteers from life groups. And worship service and Christian education classes. So pastors invite newcomers to classes, and the class facilitators report back to the pastors about their growth. So then, where's the entry point, right? So I believe, every church has different entry points. Some are wider gates than others. What we shouldn't do is copy, whatever other churches are doing just because it's working well in their context. But I think we need to examine what's the most natural flow in our own church, and we play on it. And if we need to, we can reinforce it by further building a system around it. But if there's no natural flow, then perhaps you need to think about, what's causing it, what's hindering the flow? Is there a next step to take people deeper into the life of the church? Or is there a better way to do that? Kind of things. And in our church, there are a few entry points. So if you follow the arrows, there are 3 possibilities. So worship service to life groups, worship service to ministries, and worship service to Christian education classes. And in a case of returnees, we don't normally plug them into ministries right away, although there are some people who are so ready to serve. Most likely, we'll try to connect them to a life group. And once they're settled in a life group, then we invite them to take the basics of the faith class. So yeah, we don't really put them in ministries at first, or, put them in all 3 in the beginning. That's kind of overwhelming. So the next popular entry point for us is life groups. So life groups as an entry point happens when people in a life group invites their own friends to their group. instead of saying, oh, come to my church, come to a worship service, they say, oh, I want to invite you to my life group. Oh, there's this kind of group going on. Do you want to check it out? So we are trying to make this entry point as popular as the worship service. And especially like during the pandemic when we can't gather together. So mobilizing the laity to be a witness of Christ wherever they are and being friends to bringing their friends to their life group, I think it makes so much more sense. So if you follow the arrows from life groups to worship service, life groups to Christian education classes, life groups to ministries. So in case of a returnee, we'll first give some time in the life group so they can make friends and grow comfortable, establish themselves within it. And after a while, friends in the life group can invite them to the worship service. And if they don't have an overall picture of the Christian faith, or if they haven't been baptized, the leader of the life group can encourage them to join a class or send them out. And if necessary, the life group leader can take the class with them so she's aware of the spiritual progress and the stumbling blocks of the returnee. There are certain ministries that are easier to join than others, like singing on the worship team or serving on the VBS together with other friends. So if opportunities, interest, and availability match, then the life group leader may encourage the returnee to serve on some ministries. And there are other entry points that we are working on recently. So one of them is very returnee focused. It's called the Connect group. And targeting single returnees in their 20s and 30s. So those who are involved in a Bible study while overseas have no hesitation joining a life group. But for those who only attended events or social groups, so that's, non-believers, not even seekers, the Connect group could be a good entry point. So we just started this group in April. So we won't know, but if this will be, successful in a long haul, we are hoping that way. But this group was actually created because of a request from our ministry partner in America. And he has many Japanese students who enjoyed hanging out with Christians, but hadn't gotten to the point of doing the Bible study before returning. So he really wanted those returnees to continue having a relationship with Christians so that their faith journey could continue even in Japan. So rather than completely drifting away from a Christian environment. So he actually joined our initial gathering online and he brought some of those returnees with him, and that was great. So we can see us inviting other Japanese ministry partners overseas, and they can bring some of their returnees with them. So as a core team, we have Roberta, who is also a staff member at JCFN, our young next generation pastor and college graduate student who's a returnee. So what they do in the gathering is actually very simple. They introduce each other, play games, and have time of discussion. But the whole point is to build a spiritual relationship with the returnees. And once they establish a spiritual friendship, those joining from the life group will invite the returnees to their life group. And there's another entry point that we are working on recently, which is a family ministry. In our church, we have Christian couples who are kind of mixed match. So, one spouse is a Christian, but not the other. Or also both are seekers. So the initiative started so that our church people can evangelize within their family. And, we found out that this platform totally works as one of the entry points or for returnee families, especially young families in their 30s and 40s. So yeah, we've done very, simple things. After the outdoor service, we did picnic, or there were some organized events, but most of the church families join the family ministry anyway. So, during that time, these families can build a relationship with the new returnee families. And once the spiritual like relationship is established, and then we can invite those returnees to the family life groups or mom's life group. So after hearing all of that, you might have noticed something, right? As it turns out, a special discipleship system for returnees is a myth. It's really just a normal discipleship system. So I think the question we need to be asking ourselves is, do we have a system of reproducing disciples? Rather than, how can we build a system to disciple returnees? Or how can we build a returnee ministry within our church? And once again, the majority of the returnees are either non-believers, seekers, or young Christians. And those who are, at this conference might be more of the exceptional cases, but, there are so many returnees who are not even there yet. And so, some heard all the messages or did all the Bible studies in English while they're overseas, that their understanding of the faith might be a bit iffy, or, they might have studied the Bible in bits and pieces, but not have the overall structure. And so overall, view. So that's why we think we need to provide some sort of Christian education crash course so that they'll grasp an overall picture of what Christian faith is all about. And hopefully, in their own language to ensure their understanding. So that way, they can be aligned with the rest of the church. Even if, someone is already baptized overseas, there's a chance that they didn't learn the foundational knowledge of what is expected of a disciple. And if they haven't learned, we can expect them to act like a mature believer. Like if they're not committed to a church, but rather going from one church to another, perhaps, no one taught the truth about becoming a part of the body of Christ. Or if they're not giving, maybe no one taught them to tithe. Or if they're not reading the Bible, maybe no one taught them the importance of having a personal devotion or how to do it. So like we said earlier, about never making assumptions, it's better to go over the basics so that everyone is on the same page.
Yeah, and with that, as we think about kind of our 4 pillars and the entry points and stuff, we want everything to hopefully be based on how are we trying to move them forward to being mature disciples. And so, especially as just a 12-person church, it was hard to how to move forward. But no matter what the structure, there's some basic elements that I think can help foster spiritual maturity. And so however you frame it within your church might be worded differently. And so these are just 3 examples from our church and from Rick Warren's purpose-driven church and another model. And so for us, our mission is we boil it down to 3 connectings of connecting God personally, connecting God's people, and connecting God's purposes. And so everything we do can be boiled down to, is this helping them grow in their relationship with God? So through worship, through Bible reading, through prayer, is this helping them connect with God's people? And so when life groups or, serving together, they're able to build those relationships. And then connecting God's purposes, is this helping them serve, use their gifts, reach out, be a part of God's mission, giving to help build up God's kingdom, that hopefully everything we do might be at least address one of these, if not, multiple facets. So within the life group, it could be, I'm growing in my faith, so I'm connecting God personally, but I'm also growing in relationships with others. Another model is using the cross of, thinking about worship upwards, devotion going deeper in your faith of discipleship, of growing roots, a fellowship, kind of reaching out horizontally to other people, and evangelism, of reaching out of reaching people. And then for Rick Warren, he has the 5 purposes of worship, ministry, evangelism, fellowship, and discipleship, that everything kind of revolves of, worship of loving God, ministry, loving your neighbor, evangelism, making disciples, fellowship, baptizing them, helping them grow, and discipleship, of teaching them to obey all I commanded. It's kind of flowing out of the Great Commission. And so I think whatever structure you have, just helping make sure that there's some things of what are we trying to do and what are we trying to impart is important.
maybe we'll have a time of yeah. So very briefly, just
yeah.
Oh, or we could So we'll just kind of project this. What could be the role of the internationals? And I think no matter what the language is, discipleship's done in a relationship. So that's a very important part. But so maybe we can kind of have a time of kind of sharing and Q&A. Is that good? We just need to be done by 27 after so that we can have the survey.
Stop share.
Yeah.
So are we doing breakout or just Q&A?
I think we can do
breakout.
Q&A. Do we have time for breakout though?
Or if everybody has questions, then do you have questions? If you have it,
first or you can put it in the chat.
Just write on chat. Or
do you want to share the discussion questions?
Oh.
If not, we can do breakout.
One person had a question.
Who spoke? 誰が喋ったんですか?
You have a question? Somebody, she left her.
If you have questions, just raise a hand.
I cannot hear.
はい。久井さん。
はい。
声が聞こえない。
Yeah, it's difficult to hear.
はい。もし、
久井さん、もしチャットで、声が聞こえないので、チャットで書いてもらえたらいいです。じゃあ、there's a question. Can you answer?
Yeah, how can a regular Japanese church let a non-believer serve in the church, non-spiritual serving? Yeah, I think it depends on the roles and opportunities. I think obviously there's certain functions. So I mean, like teaching a Sunday school class or to kids, obviously, if you don't know the Bible or believe it, it'd be hard to put that person in a role to teach. But of assisting, of helping, watching the kids or helping welcome people or setting, serving.
Or being in charge of like leading games, for example. I think they can also participate. Yeah.
And so finding, are there gifts? And so even like playing on the worship team, it may be this, I feel like this is a very spiritual moment of leading people in worship. So you may not feel comfortable even having them, play guitar or keyboard or whatever it may be. And so you might find you're comfortable with certain things, but not other things. We found even like translating, it might be fine to translate or interpret on certain things, but it wouldn't be of, interpreting for the sermon, because if they don't, obviously even if they're gifted in being bilingual, but they don't understand, biblical language and words, then that's going to be tough. But also really believing the message that they're communicating, I think that would be quite a stretch. But finding, are there ways, the main thing is I feel like, there's a place for you to belong and you have a part here, rather than you just, passively just receive. But that may be a way of like, wow, as I'm, welcoming people or serving drinks or whatever, like that's a way of, hey, I'm a part of this, and that may help them take that step of feeling comfortable in the church rather than just a guest who has never asked anything of them.
Yeah. Who developed the 4 pillars? It's sort of our original, like we just we took a step back and examined what exactly we are doing. And some things are working. It wasn't like this. We didn't have we sort of had the alpha course before, but we weren't regularly offering. And I think having those classes really like provides opportunities for you to have very direct conversations about their faith. So yeah, and then you're really surprised that they're thinking like so deeply about it. And they just never had the opportunities to flesh out, you know, what they're thinking. So
yeah, in the early days of the church, I mean, it was mainly the Sunday service and children's ministry, and then maybe some various events. And so it may not being able to do everything at once, but over time of finding, okay, some people are comfortable coming to a Sunday service, and so that's a great entry point. Some I have a relationship, but that's a big jump for them to come to church. But hey, they'll come to, you know, have dinner or talk or, you know, come to Christmas events. So what's the next step from that point? And so finding what is it that of meeting them where they're at and helping them. It may be being a part of a small group as a chance to feel like I belong. That's less intimidating to then, you know, get deeper connected into the church. And so figuring out what is it that's, you know, works in your context to help be that bridge to get them connected to the church.
Liz, can you say something about how much you persist in inviting returnees to come to a worship service or a life group if they say they're interested in coming but never or rarely actually join? Yeah. So yeah, I think if they say they'll come but they don't, I'd rather I would probably just focus on just meeting up with this person like individually and just hear them because I feel like
that relationship.
Yeah, because I feel like if they find it meaningful, they are heard, they're understood, or if they are encouraged, they probably want to keep meeting with you. So I probably wouldn't rush to like inviting them to like a worship service. That's like the last thing. And I think we kind of forget how long it took us, you know, for us to become a real like disciple of Christ. You know, but we just expect them to grow like so fast. So we just kind of have to be patient and okay, wow, you know, they're willing to meet up with me. Oh, that's awesome. And wow, if they're trying to like come to the life group, oh, that's so good, you know. And then, you know, just because they came once, we probably shouldn't expect them to come like on a regular basis because that's a habit, and then it takes much more time to build a habit. So, you know, but, you know, over time, like in like 2 years or something, the frequency will increase. And then they'll probably, you know, eventually come to the worship service. And, you know, we know that some don't, some do.
May not.
Yeah.
And there's no perfect, because for some people it may be like, wow, you're just overwhelming of, hey, you know, I'm trying to care and I'm trying to invite you. And so of how often or what's the frequency or just even the directness of how you do that rather than having it come up naturally. It's getting a sense of where people are at, because you don't want to push them away, but at the same time of never talking about it, just like, oh, wait till they show an interest. That may feel like, wow, 3 years have passed and there's no movement. And that's what we've seen even with the, you know, basics of the faith classes. Like, even if somebody is attending this, but they've never really shown an interest, even just inviting them to this class allows them to have conversations that normally don't happen over just kind of chit chat after the service. Like, wow, I've never actually heard, what do you actually think about these things? And so, yeah, I think giving yourself grace, like, hey, I want to be patient and sticking with the relationship that, hey, I'm still thinking about you. I still care about you. And also not making it seem like every time the conversation, it's the relationship is just focused on, hey, coming to our things rather than I care about you as a person. I think as long as they feel like there's a genuine care for them rather than, oh, I'm just, you know, a target for, you know, coming to a church or becoming a member, like that can push people away. And so
my church is also a bilingual church. We have a new leadership, and the leadership feels it's difficult to reach out to traditional Japanese people as well as foreigners and returnees all together. Do you have a target people to focus in your ministry? Yes, it is difficult, and I think a church could start heavily leaning towards one of those. But, as you start building a system, as you have that vision going, hey, we started out as heavily international, but then we always had the vision in front. We saw that Japan will experience the gospel and be transformed. If you have the vision, I think you'll really think of ways to reach out to them. So I think the leadership, I don't, if maybe you are also like on the leadership team, but maybe you can together discern like, okay, where are we now? Examining the current state and
being honest.
Yeah, being honest, not your desire, but being honest. And then, together determining, okay, so where do we want to go towards? What area do we want to expand? But yeah, like in our church too, we naturally, we have younger people, and I don't think traditional Japanese, those who are going to a smaller, more rural church where, people in their 70s, actually around the corner from our house, there's a church, and then mostly gray hair ladies join. We don't necessarily think, they will come to us, and it's okay, but perhaps what's starting to happen is that the returnees have Japanese friends who have never left Japan before, or church people have friends who've never left Japan before. So, but perhaps, they have some interest in global, environment. So they join. So yeah, it's a slow progress, but as long as you know where you want to get to, I think you'll be able to get there.
And it's hard to say of what's the easiest path. I mean, depending on what your context is and who you want to be. I mean, international may be kind of the lowest hanging fruit in a certain sense of many that come here may have already become Christians. They're just looking for a church. But in terms of making disciples and reaching out, just growing from having people who move here may not feel like, wow, are we really doing what God has called us to do? Or returnees that have some experience, or maybe are young Christians, so they come back, that might be easier in the sense of there's already an openness to the faith, where a traditional Japanese person, it may take much longer for them to even, open up or share interests. So, I mean, there's barriers on all fronts of, okay, what's the best path, or where should we, focus? But hopefully that helps. And then Yuichi asks, are you meeting online now for life groups? At the moment, I think definitely at the moment, every group is meeting online. Over the past year, we've given freedom to each of the groups. So for our young adult college group, it normally would meet in a rented space in Ikebukuro. And so there's been times where, 3 or 4 people will meet there and be on Zoom for people that are at home that can't get there or don't feel comfortable meeting in person. Some of the small, couples groups or family groups might, meet online, but then every once in a while meet at, an outdoor park, as we meet in Ikebukuro. So Minami Ikebukuro Koen, there'd be, a picnic or just time to hang out. And so, yeah, giving people freedom of online's not always the best way, but obviously what's possible in this current situation. So
sorry, we went over 2 minutes.
Okay, so